This is the lecture for pages 127 through 139. The Townsend Plan or Townsend Duty. The goal of the Townsend Duty Act was to help pay the cost of the government by imposing new duties or external taxes in the colonies. That Townsend believed the colonists would accept these duties or taxes were on colonial imports. So an external tax is something that is taxed on an import that's coming into the colonies. These such things were tea, paper, paint, lead, glass. So again, internal tax is something that internally, land, things they have, things they own that are taxed. External tax, things that are coming in from the outside. They also set up a new board of customs commissioners, aka tax collectors, which was headquartered in Boston to ensure the collection of these duties. Colonists feared that the Townshend Act was the first step towards greater British interference in colonial affairs, but they really can't do anything about it because of the Declaratory Act that was passed with the repealment of the Stamp Act and the passing of the Revenue Act of 1766. Townsend Duty provoked resistance throughout the colonies. John Dickinson is quoted as saying, "A tax is a tax is a tax. It doesn't matter." Other colonists complained the act threatened to undermine the authority of the colonial legislator, which is true, but England doesn't care. England needs help. England needs money. Of course, they're expecting the colonists to take on more of that burden, but they don't care. They've made their decision. This is what they're going to do. Americans in protest organize a non-importation movement. Basically, they are not going to import any of those things that the British have put the Townsend Duty on. And it brings them together. It forges a common sense of purpose or a reason for them to come together. And this is a big deal for the colonists. They're working together. Again, another step in the right direction. They haven't been working together. They see themselves as individual colonies. But again, another working together for a unified, making a unified front. Growing tension happens between the British in what was dubbed the Boston Massacre, even though it wasn't a massacre. Bad situation turned worse when 5 people died. The customs house in Boston is getting heckled, for lack of a better term, by colonists, and so they're given the business to the tax collectors. Well, then the redcoats are called in to kind of make sure that it doesn't get out of hand, and the colonists don't like their presence there, so they start throwing snowballs at them, and they don't get a response. And not getting a response pisses them off even more. So they start using, really packing the snowballs in and throwing them and hitting the, hitting the redcoats. Still no response. So they start putting rocks in the middle and then forming ice around them and then throwing snowballs. And this gets a response from the redcoats, and they line up and they point their guns to try to scare the colonists. Well, they don't scare them that bad, apparently. So one person mishears the word fire, fires, 5 people die. A massacre would have been an unprovoked response by the redcoats, but they're not unprovoked. They were provoked into doing it. However, with the picture that's in your book of the Boston Massacre done by Paul Revere, and the implementation of Ben Franklin's new mail system, everybody in the colonies all the way down to Georgia knows within a couple days, but it just gets blown way out of proportion. It's like the telephone game, the news just gets bigger and bigger and worse the farther down the line it gets. Not to mention John Adams, who eventually became president. His job is to represent the redcoats, and he does, and he gets them off, and they don't face any punishment. So the colonists aren't mad at John Adams. He was just doing his job, but they're mad at the whole situation, and it gets them to fight even harder with this non-importation act. They have a partial repeal of the Townsend Duty due to the Boston Massacre and the recent events, and but their trust is gone in the British authority. the PowerPoint says propaganda question mark. Absolutely. I mean, we use the Boston Massacre as propaganda to whip people into a frenzy to do this even more. Um, how was it used for the colonists' advantage after the Boston Massacre? And just like remember the Alamo for Texans. I mean, it's remember the Boston Massacre. Remember what they did. We can't trust them. And they just keep pushing the envelope that way. Various incidents led colonial leaders to resolve to keep one another informed, including the Gatsby incident, where some colonists light a customs boat on fire and shoot the captain. The boat was named the Gatsby, so that's why it's known as the Gatsby incident. And so the colonists, decide to form a committee called the Committee of Correspondence, which basically is just a way to keep each other informed. What the British are doing, what the Redcoats are doing, if something secretive is going on, something fishy is going on, just to kind of keep each other informed of what's going on. We talked about the Paxton Boys last time. Now this is the same sort of thing. The regulators are a vigilante group that are going out throughout South Carolina and North Carolina because the British aren't handling it. The colonial legislators not handling it. Nobody's really handling the problems that are going on. So these outlaws are threatening property, but it's a bigger problem in the fact of representation, political representation. Again, they still haven't solved this problem of virtual versus actual representation, even in the colonies themselves. I mean, it starts in the right direction, but it is not perfect by any stretch. Anti-slavery movement, we'll touch on this here. This is kind of like the first significant attack on slavery. It's generated by the Bible, religious concerns. I mean, you can use the Bible to justify slavery. Hey, there was slavery in the Bible, so slavery's fine. You can also use the Bible to say love your neighbor as yourself, and then that way you wouldn't have slavery. Again, we're using the Bible as a document, but a large majority of the colonists are religious, so it is a big deal. And so the colonists are yelling for their own liberty, and which is another word for freedom. But they're saying, what about slavery? Is this a catchy, touchy situation? All right, the final nail in the coffin. With the possible bankruptcy of the British East India Company, Lord North, who's in charge of the colonies, issues the Tea Act of 1773. The Tea Act of 1773 basically lowers the cost of tea because there's no tax on it in England. But the colonists still see this, as it shows here, as still having them to pay the Townshend duty. So they're still having to pay a tax. So a tax is a tax is a tax. They don't care. So the Sons of Liberty dress up as Native Americans. Why? We are not quite sure, but they dress up like Native Americans and throw roughly $3.2 million worth of tea in today's money into the Boston Harbor. This is something that the British East India Company cannot come back from. They are already on the verge of bankruptcy, and now they have to deal with this blow. So Parliament, Lord North, have to come down hard on the colonies, and they do. They come down hard on the colonies with the coercive acts, but the colonists know them as the intolerable acts. Coerce somebody is to move them in the right direction with a leash or some sort of hanging over their head, something to move them in the direction you want them to go. The intolerable acts, intolerable mean you can't live with it. You can't live with them. Sorry about that. So let's get into the coercive acts / intolerable acts, because again, these are, my goodness, these acts are interchangeable. Coercive act, intolerable acts, don't get them confused. They're the exact same thing, okay? So the coercive acts include Boston Port Act, which closed the Port of Boston. The Administration of Justice Act, which offered lenient treatment to government officials who killed somebody performing their duty. So this means a redcoat can just literally go kill anybody he wants and say, oh, it was in the form of my duty, and then they're going to get sent back to England to be tried. So they won't be found guilty. One other thing on the Boston Port Act, they'll open the port again as long as the tea is paid for, but the tea won't ever be paid for, so the Boston Port Act just basically, in effect, closes the Port of Boston for good. The Massachusetts Governing Act changes the Massachusetts Colonial Charter, so basically it eliminates the legislator and basically takes the colonists out of control. And the Quartering Act, the big one, which allowed British troops to be lodged in any uninhabited building, which uninhabited building means church. So now, or, it's not inhabited, it's not lived in, so therefore they can put their troops there. And that's the Quartering Act of 1774. Along with these 4 acts comes a 5th act. It's not included in the Intolerable Acts. It is not the same as the Intolerable Acts. It's not included in the Intolerable/Coercive Acts, but it is a big one. It's called the Quebec Act, and it changes the administration and boundaries of the colony. It opens up the Ohio River Valley to those citizens that are living in British Canada. Now, if we jump back and we remember that the British citizens that are in Canada at this point were French citizens. Most French people are Catholic. So not only are they're opening up that land that was closed off to the British colonists due to the Proclamation of 1763, we're opening it up to Catholics, which is a big no-no religiously because majority of the colonists in America, in the English colonies, are Protestants. But it also allows the enemy, the people we were fighting, the people the colonists were fighting, the French, to occupy the territory that we, the English colonists, won in the French and Indian War. Why in God's good name would we be okay with that? We win a war, we don't get the land, we aren't able to use the land, and the people we beat, who we're supposed to take it from, get to occupy that land. Makes absolutely no sense. Okay? This is where it opens up the boundaries of Quebec, allows them into the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes, and it just upsets the colonists. Americans saw the Intolerable Acts as a threat to their expansion, the status of their religion, and the power and authority of their colonial legislators. They cannot stand for it. So they call together the First Continental Congress. 55 delegates meet in Philadelphia where they pass the Suffolk Resolves. The Suffolk Resolves, which the definition is back a few slides. I'm having to hurry because we're getting towards the end. But the Suffolk Resolves denounce the Coercive Acts as unconstitutional. They advise people to arm, and they call for economic sanctions against Britain. So it's threefold. Unconstitutional, even though there is no British Constitution, they say it's unconstitutional. They advise the people to arm, and they call for economic sanctions against Britain. But how are we going to enforce this? How are we going to make sure it happens? Well, they pass the Continental Association, and the Continental Association is small groups in various towns that make sure that people are arming, that they are following the ideas of the Suffolk Resolves, which is sanctions against Britain and arming. The big thing is arming, getting ready. We are not saying revolution at this point, but getting ready just in case that may happen. Chart in your book, you should know it. Even well-known radicals are not advocating independence. Most hope and expected Britain would change. Americans were divided over the extent of how far legitimately Parliament could go and what their power was and everything else. But Americans are split into a third, a third, and a third. Okay, a third of the Americans are Whigs, who will eventually become revolutionaries, who are for colonial rights. The other third, the second third, is the people that are for the crown and that they oppose colonial rights, and they're known as the Tories. And the other third are undecideds. They are, I'm going to stand back on the fence. I'm going to check this out. I'm going to see how it's going to go, but I'm not going to choose sides at this point. And so that is a big deal because the colonies are split. We don't exactly know what's going to happen, how it's going to go at all. Definition of Whigs. Definition of Tories. Poor Mr. Malcolm, who was tarred and feathered, which we talked about in class. And that's it. Get ready for that test over chapters 4 and 5. And that's it for the lecture over 127 through 139.